From the Alvin and Rosalie Sarachek studio, PBS Kansas presents Kansas Week.
2023 is almost a memory, and it takes with it a lot of headlines you'll always remember. From the investigation into whether BTK had more victims than we thought, to a disgraced lawmaker and fight after fight after fight at the State House. Today, we take a look at some of the biggest stories of the year. That's what we're talking about right now on Kansas Week. I'm Pilar Pedraza, and this is Kansas Week. As you get ready to bid the year goodbye, we all know some of the biggest stories we've brought you this year will still be making headlines come 2024. But which ones are the biggest? Well, that's kind of up to interpretation. Today, we take a look at some I think are worth remembering, and you tell me which ones I've missed. We begin with a fight over First Amendment rights at a Kansas newspaper. This video of the raid on the Marion County Record went viral almost as soon as the editor posted it. Then the editor's mother, the paper's co-owner, died. The coroner's report saying in part due to stress from the raids. Within days of this going viral, the county retracted the warrant, saying it didn't have the evidence to support it, and eventually returned the confiscated computer and electronic equipment. The police chief and city manager have both resigned. Voters sent a city councilwoman in the middle of the ruckus home. And a local business owner many blamed for the whole fiasco said she never asked for any of it. All of this brought news crews and First Amendment advocates from around the country to small-town Kansas, sparked lawsuits, and increased the paper's circulation exponentially. While the initial furor this event raised has quieted down, it's a certainty we've not heard the last of it. So what makes this such a big story? Here to take a look at this and other major headlines of the year, we have with us Angela Smith, president of the Wichita chapter of the Kansas Association of Black Journalists, and Dr. Neil Allen, political scientist from Wichita State University, as well as Diane Leffler, the opinion editor of the Wichita Eagle. And we have also with us a first-timer, Sarah Myers, an environmental activist with the organization ICT Tree Huggers. So thank you all so much for joining us. And that's the question to start off. What makes this and really our other stories, big stories, what are the elements that make a story memorable?
Well, there are just so many elements to the Marion story. I mean, it just defies description almost. I think the biggest element obviously was the 98-year-old co-owner of the paper dying the day after this raid. I myself was writing our editorial for the Eagle and the Kansas City Star. We decided to take the rare step of issuing a joint editorial because it was such an outrage when I found out that she had passed, and I had to rewrite my story around that. Mm-hmm. I've been a journalist for probably almost 40 years, and I never had experienced that before. No. It really shook me up.
What about from an outsider's perspective? You're not a journalist. What do you think, Sarah?
As I was researching the story, it's just surprising to me the lack of compassion, especially when it goes to our senior community. I mean, the poor woman was so stressed out, and the fact that she just passed away, you know, it just kind of sets a unique standard towards law enforcement, especially when it comes to the elder community, at least to me. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it was unprecedented. This had never happened in my lifetime that I had known of, you know, as a journalist. And you could just see that it was, like you said, viral. It was picked up all over the country, all over the nation to see.
Internationally.
Internationally, exactly, for a police department to come in and to take the computers and source information from a newspaper. So it was one we've been covering ever since. You know, every, I think, week or month there's a new development that comes out of that case, and we'll continue to follow it as we get more information.
Speaking of which, just before we sat down to record this episode, another new development in that case, Judicial Ethics Commission ruling that the magistrate judge who signed the warrant didn't do anything wrong, and raising questions perhaps about the secrecy behind what the Judicial Ethics Commission does and how it works.
And also, you mentioned secrecy. I mean, democracy dies in darkness. I mean, that, you know, that happens to be the motto of the Washington Post, but it's just a basic statement about how democratic government works. And in America, we like to think that because we have a good constitution, because we had good founding fathers, if you believe that, and because we have an election system of electing, you know, our fellow citizens and checks and balances, that we're not going to have things like this. But we have to understand that there are people who have interests in keeping things secret, and sometimes people will use powers that are available to them to do so. And also, to just plug the importance of journalism, I mean, without reporters, we wouldn't know about this. Without the Eagle and the Star and their budgets from being metro papers, the rest of the world wouldn't know about this. And if we don't have small town newspapers or their equivalent, then we don't know what is happening in small towns. And people in Marion County are as important as anybody else in the world. And you know, this case shows that it is possible for the levers of government to be used against individuals, taking away their freedom, and also giving them stress that causes them medical problems. And just because we live in the United States doesn't mean that we can stop being vigilant about our government being, frankly, totalitarian.
I have a lot of friends and family from all over the world, and for the non-American members, the one thing I heard from all of them was, this is what we expect to see in a third world country, not in the United States.
Well, the abuse of power in this case was just rampant. I mean, first of all, the paper was investigating the police chief and the restaurateur on different subjects. And then we just recently found out by going through all the body cam footage that the police chief called her in the midst of the raid and called her honey. So I think we all know what's going on here, and it's just an incredible mess. We have one federal lawsuit filed so far by Deb Groover. She was a reporter for the paper, and her cell phone was snatched from her hand by the police chief and aggravated a dislocated finger that she had. And you know, I mean, this was not a search for evidence. This was an effort to intimidate and to shut down that paper. And they succeeded for a while, but in the end, the paper won.
Well, and the paper got their next paper out without all of their equipment.
Yeah.
All right. Well, what else are we still talking about? How about the investigation into whoever mailed letters with white powder to dozens of Republican Kansas lawmakers, as well as elected leaders in other states? The hunt continues to find the person who sent letters containing white powder to state lawmakers and other elected Republican officials in Kansas and 2 other states this last summer. Along with the powder, the letters contain notes saying, "It is important not to choke on your ambition." The Kansas Bureau of Investigation reported struggling with a response to these letters. More than 100 of them arrived in mailboxes at the homes and offices of Kansas Republican politicians alone. The KBI said all of its bomb squads and hazmat units were involved in the response for 4 days, causing agents to miss, among other things, the chance at a possible seizure of a large fentanyl shipment. State lawmakers say they're still struggling with the fallout from getting these letters. The Kansas Reflector reports Senator Rick Clues of Barryton remains haunted by the possibility of what could have happened. He was on vacation at the time and his son collected his mail. The Reflector quotes Clues as saying, "The emotional trauma and seeing my wife in tears, I hope to God we catch whoever did this and that this legislature looks at something in the future to protect ourselves more and our families. This isn't a game, and it isn't a Democrat-Republican issue. This is a safety issue." The FBI took over the investigation in late July due to similar letter deliveries in states such as Tennessee and Montana. Now, the cost, both financial and emotional, part of what makes this such a big story. But what else?
Well, I think we have to remember that being an elected official is a tremendously difficult job for a lot of people. Now, there's people that have lots of ambition, and that's why they do that. and that's part of it. But you know, those of you that work in TV news, you have crazy people emailing you all the time, and for legislators, they have the same kind of fear sometimes. And also, whenever in Kansas right now we pay our legislators $22,000 a year, although that'll likely increase in the future, probably next year. You know, we have to remember that while we might not like what some of our elected officials do, and there's probably none of us that agree with everything our government does, these are people that are doing a high stress, high status, and often dangerous job. And we're paying them $22,000 to leave their families and argue with a bunch of other people for a few months. And it just shows that we have to understand that a legislature is a workplace like any other.
Angela?
Yeah, I think you're looking at the two things. You have the political landscape, and you see where you have people sending out these letters. Like you said, you have to deal with people who may not be all there, for lack of a better term. And then you have a lack of resources. Obviously, you're pulling the KPI off of this situation to have to cover the letters, investigate, and then they miss out on the seizure, the fentanyl seizure, which we're already dealing with a lack of resources in law enforcement across the state. So I think you have a twofold situation that you're dealing with here. And I think it's the person who did it, if they figure out whoever did it, kind of probably wanted that. You know, they wanted to make sure that they weren't going to be able to tend to all of the different issues, as well as the political climate that we have going on. And we just have to, you know, stay vigilant. And I think that's kind of the safety issue that they're kind of talking about. So I think it's one of those things that it's going to come up, and it's just more often now that we're going to see it.
Sarah, what do you think?
I think a lot of people are very lonely in the world right now, as well as there's a realm just to want to be heard, especially between just the people and local or, you know, larger government forces. So I just wish there was a way to maybe innovate so that people felt heard.
Yeah. Well, and Diane, that kind of plays into also another issue that we saw, which was all the SWAT calls at schools around the state.
Yeah, I mean, it just, these, you know, just people need to get a grip, you know? I mean, these times that we're living in have gotten so chaotic that everybody feels just untethered. And when you see something like this with the white powder or the swatting calls or any of these things, and it just makes you heartsick. You know, I mean, I'm gonna quote Rodney King, can we all get along? You know, I mean, it really is a sad commentary on our society and what we've become.
Yeah. Well, perhaps part of the tension leading to those letters, the knockdown, drag 'em out, highly emotional fight in the legislature this year over several bills impacting the LGBTQ community. From a proposed ban on transgender athletes in state-sponsored school sports to one on gender-affirming care in drag show performances for minors and what supporters called a Women's Bill of Rights. Bills impacting the LGBTQ community took center stage at the State House this last session. Equality Kansas called the transgender athlete bill a bullying tactic and warned that determining students' gender could mean an invasive and humiliating physical examination. In the end, lawmakers approved the bill called a Women's Bill of Rights that banned transgender women from women's restrooms, locker rooms, prisons, and domestic violence shelters, overriding the governor's veto. Supporters say it will make cisgender women safer in public spaces. Critics say it will weaken organizations that help keep women safe by forcing them to forfeit money. Lawmakers fell one vote short, though, in the Senate of overriding the governor's veto on a bill that would let families sue doctors for prescribing puberty blockers, hormone treatment, and vasectomies, among other procedures for minors. And these bills made, once again, national news coming out of Kansas. I know we talked about it a lot here on this show, but I'm wondering, outside of the belt, shall we say, the political belt, those of us who are paying attention, how much of an impact, how aware was the public, Sarah, do you think?
I think when it comes to LGBTQ issues, I think The public definitely is up in arms because it's another realm of just being controlled. And I think, you know, a lot of people just want to be liberated in that way and be able to stand in their own authenticity, whatever that looks like, as well as their originality. It obviously always, you know, children are such a very sensitive space just because they are the realm of creativity and literally walking geniuses. So I just think there's so much room, again, for innovation, as well as, you know, making sure that the human rights are always protected no matter what. If we don't remember our history, it will repeat itself in some form or fashion.
Angela?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you had said earlier about compassion, and I think that's what a lot of this has to do with, maybe a lack of compassion for some people, not understanding what another person is going through. And then I think you have to deal with the fear of not knowing what you don't know. And so I think a lot of these bills are born out of that, a lot of these laws. And as far as Kansas and as for how we look, I think that it's a referendum from a lot of different places, and we're all there. Everyone is trying to move forward in this same thought pattern. And I don't know that if it's a positive move forward, but they're taking what they've been told and they're trying to push the agenda. So I think that's kind of where you're going to see several. You saw kind of a sweep of legislation, of the same legislation, excuse me, across the country, and we'll see how far it goes.
Yeah.
And also on some of the questions about gender identity and, you know, the government's role, you know, in public schools or other parts of society, I want to say a couple things. First, if the government is in the position of needing to ask an adult what is inside their pants, then it's probably a bad idea. If we're making laws where in order to do a school activity, we're going to have to try to determine what is under the of a child, then you can be certain that's a bad idea. So that, especially on the issue of sports, that if you're in a situation where one team can say, we think that person should not be competing because they are really a boy or a girl or whatever, then you have now obliterated much of the reason for that activity, because it's about giving kids an opportunity to have a safe space to be themselves and grow up. And that we really have to rethink this idea that schools and children in schools are going to be guinea pigs, not for the positive parts of our society, but our own fears about which direction culture is going.
Well, and I think the thing too is okay, these are insulting and demeaning laws, but beyond that, they are actively dangerous. I don't know who ever thought that it would be a good idea to put transgender women into the men's population at a prison, but that's what this bill does. And frankly, the cynicism that this all passed with was just mind-blowing. Women's Bill of Rights. Well, you know, we have several women here, and I'm wondering if, you know, maybe equal pay or, you know, I can think of a lot of rights that women in this society need, but to call it the Women's Bill of Rights is just beyond.
There are those, of course, who supported this bill who really feel that it's protective and that they needed it because, again, as you guys mentioned, the fear of some of the changes that are going on in society. I don't want to take that away from their honest opinion. Obviously, we have kind of one opinion here on the table, and we try to have various opinions in this show. So I just want to kind of bring that out and make sure we mention that as well.
Well, I can go ahead. I can say that hearing from parents on both sides, because I've heard from parents who said, you know, I don't want my daughter in the locker room with someone else, or but then others who say, I want my child to be able to grow up and be the person who they are meant to be. So I think the big thing is taking that right away from the parent.
Yeah.
So we have these children that we're supposed to raise up, and then the government comes in and tells you this is what you're supposed to do. So I think that may be the bigger issue, and I think it's on what grounds or who are we protecting? And that's the questions that you have to ask.
Okay. Well, another big story sure to make more headlines next year. The criminal trial of former state lawmaker Michael Capps, now appealing his conviction of fraud over COVID relief funds for small businesses. This last February, a federal jury convicted former state representative Michael Capps of 12 felonies for lying on applications for federal COVID relief funds. In May, the judge sentenced Capps to over 2 years in prison. The prosecution had argued he should spend more than 4 years behind bars, saying he, quote, continues to show neither remorse nor contrition over stealing nearly $500,000 meant to help businesses stay afloat during the pandemic. Capps was scheduled to serve his sentence at a facility in Oklahoma, but that has been put on hold, and the court has released Capps while he pursues a new trial, saying there's reason to believe he'll get that new trial. And I've certainly gotten a lot of requests both during the trial and afterward for updates on what's going on. Is he behind bars yet? A lot of folks very interested in that. Definitely a story we're going to continue to follow. A lot of elements there.
That's certainly true. And also, while our justice process sometimes moves slower than we would like because we protect the rights of individuals, that it's just best for democracy to not have people elected who defraud the government, defame other elected officials, and also, are just completely unwilling to follow the laws of the country. And also, Michael Capps was in the legislature partly because the person who was in his seat beforehand waited until the day of the filing deadline, withdrew his filing papers, and then Michael Capps got a safe Republican seat. And we should all remember that legislators are people too. They deserve a living wage, but also they deserve scrutiny as potential, in this case, felons and fraudsters.
All right. Well, that's 4 of the biggest stories of the year. What else should we be talking about today? Well, I considered a lot of different stories when I was putting them together. Here's just a few. The return of BTK, as an Oklahoma sheriff launched an investigation into whether he committed another murder down there. The lack of marijuana legalization legislation here in Kansas, leaving our state one of just 3 with neither medical nor recreational usage. A new mayor for Wichita. The tragic death of Topeka toddler Zoe Felix, raped and killed in a homeless camp despite warnings to DCF. The ongoing fight over special education funding in Kansas, a potential 50% hike in pay for Kansas lawmakers, and the abortion legislation, lawsuits, and court rulings over the last year. That's just some of them. I stopped there because we ran out of room on the page. There were several others I could have come up with. What else should we be including in this show? Who haven't I started with yet? I started with everybody at some point. Neil, what's your thought?
Well, actually, I'll combine a couple of the 2 of them about marijuana legislation and the fact that it hasn't passed, and also abortion, because one feature of Kansas politics and our governmental structure is that we do not have the ability as citizens to get something on the ballot to vote on, and so if you look at it, our political culture and our partisan voting patterns are very similar to Missouri next door, and they have legal marijuana, they have state minimum wage, they have state protected worker protections, and it's not because their politicians want them, it's because their voters voted for them. Here in Kansas, our legislature thought that citizens were going to vote to limit a woman's right to choose, and they guessed wrong, and by them both failed. But on issues of marijuana, if you put that on the ballot, medical marijuana would pass in a landslide. Adult use or recreational marijuana would probably pass with a good campaign. But we have legislators that, because of how people vote in Kansas, are Republicans, and partly because we don't pay them enough. It's often people who are independently wealthy and who are older, and also who are more socially conservative, and so they don't want to move us in a direction where the rest of the country is.
Angela?
I would say the 29th and Grove water contamination, that was a big deal here in Wichita, especially in the northeast Wichita area. The KDHE coming out saying that they had been investigating this for a good amount of time before the community was actually notified about it. I think it just tells that a disenfranchised community is always the last to know what's going on in their neighborhood. And I think it's one that we're going to be following for decades to come as well.
Sarah, what about you?
I would have to agree. I think a lot of this pollution, especially in marginalized communities, is just unjust. I've had 7 members of my family this year die because of cancer. They're all living on the north side. It's not definitely not the end of the travesty, and I think that a lot of these big polluters need to make sure that they're cleaning up their mess. Given that a lot of marginalized communities are often targeted for industrial beings or, you know, railroad tracks or things of that nature, you know, it just is like, when are we going to stop dumping, you know, the waste into marginalized communities, especially emphasis communities of color? So I think we just need to do a little more cleaning up and a little more hugging.
What about you, Diane? What should we have included?
Well, the story that people keep asking me about, and I don't have any answers for them yet because it's moving through our court system, is the shooting that took place when a couple, an older couple, they were driving home from a football game on a Friday night, and these stunt bikers had taken over an intersection and were doing their stunts and such, and so there was a minor collision, and so the couple that were in their pickup truck drove away, and they were chased by several of the bikers, and one of them pulled a gun and shot the woman in the passenger seat, killing her. So it was just that was that was wrenching for this community.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us, Diane, Sarah, Angela, and Neil. I really appreciate it. I hope you have enjoyed our conversation. We'd also like to thank our news partners for sharing their materials with us at the Cake News, KSN News, and the Wichita Eagle. We'd love to continue the conversation on social media. Just look for Pilar Pedraza TV and PBS Kansas on the platform nearest you. For now, stay safe and have a great week.